Hello, welcome to the Ukrainian Studies Organization at Indiana University. I'm Natalia Shpilova-Said, and thank you so much for attending our talk today. Our speaker is Myroslav Shkandrij, and he presents on the seductive charm of empire and resistance to its designs, modern Russian and Ukrainian literatures. Dr. Myroslav Shkandrij is Professor Emeritus of Slavic Studies at the University of Manitoba. He wrote on the cultural and political history of Ukraine, the avant-garde, nationalism, Jewish-Ukrainian relations, Russian-Ukrainian relations, and post-colonial theory, and has curated exhibitions at the Winnipeg Art Galleries, Hamilton Art Gallery, Ukrainian Museum in New York, and Oseredok, Ukrainian Cultural and Educational Center in Winnipeg. Myroslav Shkandrij authored a number of books, including Revolutionary Ukraine, 1917-2017, Flashpoints in History and Contemporary Memory Voice, which was published in 2019. I don't have this copy, but I have the next one, Avant-garde Art in Ukraine, Contested Memory, 1910-1930, which was published in 2019. Jews in Ukrainian Literature, Representation and Identity, Russia and Ukraine, Literature and the Discourse of Empire from Napoleonic to Postcolonial Times. It was published back in 2001, but I have this copy as well. So we will start with Dr. Shkandrij's lecture. As usual, please submit your comments and questions via Q&A option, which you can see at the bottom of the screen. All questions and comments will be addressed during our discussion session. Well, at this point, I'll invite Myroslav to present his talk. And again, thank you so much for joining our series.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be with you again. Usually these talks that are based on a book begin with some comments about why a person wrote the book. So maybe I'll begin with that. The post-colonial studies became very popular towards the end of the last century. And one of the things that that I noticed as a Slavist was that many of the devices, the methodologies used seemed relevant to Ukrainian-Russian relations and to the study of the Russian Empire, Russian literature. But I couldn't find anything about that. It seemed that post-colonial studies was absolutely focused on overseas territories, non-Western, non-European aspects of empire, and especially not on contiguous territories. But that was how the Russian Empire developed, by adding close territories, neighboring territories. And yet it seemed to me that that's wrong, because after all, the Russian Empire had a long relationship, which is reflected in literature, a long relationship with Ukraine, Poland, the Caucasus, Siberia, and all these sort of patterns of description, these various tropes that are used in analyzing post-colonials, in using post-colonial approaches, are relevant to Russian literature and to the Ukrainian response to it. So I looked at this as a discourse, as post-colonial discourse with sort of regulated rules and structures. And I immediately thought that, this is very typical of post-colonial writing or post-colonial research. On the one hand, you have a powerful, prestigious empire, which sells itself as being sophisticated, modern, which legitimizes its expansion. And on the other hand, you have this portrayal in Russian literature in particular, Imperial literature in particular, of others, particularly Ukraine, as well. It's portrayed differently, but typically as antique, rural, primitive, maybe even violent. And the narratives are always assimilation is positive, narratives of union, brotherhood, denial of alterity, difference. And on the other hand, sort of resistance to expansion as negative. So that's where I started. And using post-colonial theory, I kind of brought together various tropes, things that I thought were typical. So if you read my book, you'll see them. You can look at the descriptions there, but they are basically the following. And this is very typical throughout the 19th century in particular, also the 18th century. Ukraine is an anarchic borderland. And it actually is described as a wild land in Polish writings as well as in Russian writings. Well, what does that mean? That means a place that is uncultivated, at the limits of the civilized world. Sometimes in the early 19th century literature is described as the boundary with Asia. It's also a dangerous zone of confrontation and intermingling. And this becomes then a kind of, as is very typical in post-colonial writings, a kind of a duality. On the one hand, it's sparsely populated. It's a virgin land. It's a place for exploration. On the other hand, it is portrayed as something hybrid, tainted by foreign influences, slightly dangerous. And you get this sort of alternation in descriptions of Ukraine in particular as this kind of borderland, which is on the one hand attractive, on the other hand, slightly to be feared. Another trope is the single Rus or Rus nation. And this is also very typical even to this day. The idea was created early in the 19th century. The idea arose of a tripartite nation, Belarus, as it is today, Ukraine, and Russia. They share the same blood group, the consanguineous. They are of the same Orthodox faith. They have one history. In fact, they are one divided tribe. It used to be one tribe that has been divided. And, you know, this, on the one hand, is attractive. It promotes the idea of Ukraine as being similar. Sometimes it's even shown as the infancy of Russia in a previous early time. But on the other hand, it is also demeaning because it is a place that has remained stuck in this past, this infancy. It doesn't have a high culture. Any form of political separatism is immediately attacked. So the single Rus nation, which today you sort of see in the idea of Russian world, is another trope. Very common to empires is this glorification of vastness, power. Triumphs are applauded. Conquests are cheered. Everybody genuflects to invincibility. And in fact, even some Russian authors, like Tuchev, for example, wrote about a borderless Russia. Russia doesn't have any borders. It can go as far as it wants. It's possible to expand all the way into Europe, North America, and elsewhere, Asia. So if vastness, glory, power are important, then how do you keep together an empire like this? One requirement is absolutism. And you get this this 19th century in particular, you get this defense of keeping a cohesive, powerful empire through absolutism, through monarchy. Any small nations with political aspirations within the empire are dangerous, and the empire has a right to integrate, to colonize, also to suppress. You get echoes of this, I think, in apologism for Stalinism, for example, for the Soviet expansionism. Small is bad, big, unified is good. And you get this even in among contemporary historians and political theorists sometimes, this temptation of empire, as I call it. There was in the 19th century a sense of a divine mission. This is something that is not that popular now, but with the growth of the revival of the Russian Orthodox Church, there are some tendencies in that direction. The idea that Russia's expansion is sanctified by God, by the true faith, by holy Russia. Resistance is hopeless because this expansion, this messianic expansion is justified by God himself. And so around this, you get the various, different discussions about the Russian soul, something that has always puzzled and offended me personally. But this idea that the Russian soul can be expansive. I mean, we don't understand it. It is beyond Western comprehension. These uptight Westerners just don't understand this sort of emotional Russian. For me, it's always seemed like an excuse for irresponsibility. I've never understood that, but it is charming to a lot of Westerners, particularly, I think, to the British, who seem to be, maybe because they themselves are a little bit, well, I shouldn't say bad things because I'm British. I have a British passport myself, but they're sort of viewed as uptight. So they're attracted to this Slavic expansiveness. Another thing that I noticed, which I don't think a lot of people have written about, is this idea of the organic growth. In the 19th century, beginning with the travelogues of the early century, the idea was always put forward that Russian expansion was never violent, was never forced. The power of the Russian was so magnetic, the attraction was so great, that people voluntarily joined. They described it as a state founded on love, a state in which people should be happy to participate in the great destiny of Russia. Well, the other side, the flip side of this coin is that non-Russians are viewed as an ethnographic material, a mulch, a mass. And they are to become part, they're not important, they just become part of the great Russian march forward. And you get echoes of this later in the Eurasianists of the 1920s and 30s, even in Bolshevism. It's a sort of actually quite typical view of imperialists. Well, a further trope in my mind is this sort of, it follows from the previous comments, this trope of cultural superiority. let's bow down before Fabergé eggs. Fabergé eggs, aren't they wonderful? Isn't imperial culture terrific? Look at what they produced. This sort of sense that others can't do this, but Russia has achieved it, is also typical of empire. So this glorification of the Sputniks, the rockets, goes hand in hand with preaching to borderland peoples and people abroad. So, you know, if you read Lomonosov from the 18th century on Manchuria, conquering Manchuria, Ryleyev on conquering Mexico and California, Dostoevsky on taking Constantinople, all these things are very, very typical of a Russian sense of superiority. How could you not want to be part of this glamorous, glorious culture? I can quote you a few interesting passages from some of these travelogues, because they do, in fact, open your eyes to what was very typical at that time, and the kind of tropes that were developed. One of my favorites is the comparison that was made in an early travelogue, a Russian who traveled to Ukraine, Dolgoruki, where he talks about the ox as the living representation of the chochol, the Ukrainian, who is just as bestial and lazy. If an ox is not pushed, it will spend days and nights on the same spot. This is actually fairly mild compared to the next quote. This, you know, sounds to me almost like it could have come from Conrad's Heart of Darkness. Dolgoruki, the prince, writes his impression of Ukrainians, the chochol. I'll read it, it's a passage. The chochol appears to me created by nature to till the land, sweat, burn in the sun, spend his whole life with a bronzed face. The rays of the sun burnished him to the extent that he shines as though covered in varnish. And his entire skull turns from yellow to a green hue. However, he does not grieve over such an enslaved condition. He knows nothing better. I have spoken with him. He knows his plow, ox, stack, whiskey, and that constitutes the entire lexicon. If the chochol complains about his condition, then the reason for his indignation has to be sought in the cruelty of the landlord, because he willingly bears any fate and any labor. However, he needs constant prodding, because he is very lazy. He and his ox will fall asleep and wake up 5 times in 1 minute. This, at least, is what I have observed, and I dare think if this entire people did not owe a debt to well-mannered landlords for their benevolence and respect for their humanity, the chochols would be difficult to separate from the Negro in any way. One sweats over sugar, the other over grain. May the Lord give them both good health. So, I mean, I was stunned when I read that. I couldn't believe it. What better explanation does one have for illustration does one have for a colonial tendency in Russian literature? I'll read you a couple more great quotes a little bit later. So the message to Ukrainians in this literature, early 19th century literature, was that assimilation was redemptive. And Russian literature is special. Dostoevsky said this of Pushkin. It has a capacity to represent everybody authentically. It is a universalist literature. So why would you want to have your own literature when Russia can do it for you and do it better? And this becomes typical of the late 19th century as well. Outside Herzen, and the extreme left, Chernyshevsky and others, almost nobody, liberal or conservative, had much to say about Ukraine and Ukraine's rights. Gertsen or Herzen was at least was one who said Ukraine must be recognized as a free and independent country. Russian liberalism failed on the Ukrainian question, and it is still failing today. If you look at Nemtsov and you look at what the Russian liberals say, it is suspiciously tainted by this imperialist tradition. So the message to the Ukrainians was, yes, you should assimilate. And yet there were problems. In Russian literature, if you read it carefully, I think there's constant nervousness about the Ukraine, about Ukrainian culture and Ukrainians. Even at the very beginning, with these first travelogues, there's a sense of foreignness, a sense of alterity, even a shock as they crossed the border. And by the way, there was a border, yellow and blue stripes around poles. And the moment these Russian travelers crossed the border, they felt they were in a foreign country, and they wrote that. The language was different. The people dressed differently. The houses were different. The culture was different. They were confused by this. Sometimes they felt that people refused to understand Russian. They refused to understand us, is one quote. Sometimes they felt they were being mocked. After all, Ukrainians would start singing a song, a mocking song, an abusive song about Russians, Muscovites. This they felt was a sign of bad manners. But it was, after all, to be a natural paradise. It was warm, it was beautiful. It was described as a second Italy, an Arcadia. And so these enormous difficulties, as they are described in dealing with the people, had to be overcome. It was, after all, going to be part of the imperial bonanza. And that's also how it's described. So you have this duality, an ancient past, a folkloric innocence, but it needs firm rule. A quaint, anachronistic land, but the people are a bit animal-like, bestial, lazy. They're sometimes charming, talented, colorful, but they can be dangerous and treacherous and rebellious. And so Russian literature developed this triple image of Ukrainians. There are Mazeppa types, if they're rebellious. There are Little Russian types, if they are regional Russians, or they're Chochols, if they are nondescript peasants. Well, how did Ukrainians respond? Obviously, they wanted to recover what we in postcolonial studies talk about as subaltern voices. They wanted to show that they were a culture, a civilization, they had their own popular traditions, they had their own language, they had their own history, and they rejected hegemony. So there's a lot of knots, a lot of counters. One of the knots is we are not an invention of some other power. We're not invented by the Germans or the Austrians or anyone, or the Poles or anyone else to make life difficult for Russians. We are not historyless. We do have a history. We are not voiceless. We do not want to assimilate. Well, this becomes typical of the response, and it persisted throughout the 19th century. But it's a dependency of rejection. You're always reacting to something. Gradually, throughout the 19th century, Ukrainians developed their own sense of self-awareness in their literature, a high culture, and this became a challenge that many intellectuals in the Russian Empire, Russian intellectuals, did not understand. George Grabovich has written about the horizon of expectation. The horizon of expectation in Ukrainian literature and culture differed from what the Russian intellectuals had gotten used to and what they expected. And so by the end of the century, they were shocked and offended when they discovered Ukrainians writing in this funny language. Why would you want to write in this? Publishing abroad. It was incomprehensible to them. Well, the modernist period, which is, say, from the 1890s to the First World War and afterwards, 1920s, was really a period when Ukrainians began finding a completely different voice. They rejected the role that had been imposed on them. They created their own identity, and they had some advantages. What we call today Western Ukraine was part of Austro-Hungary. It had access to European languages, European culture, European centers. It modeled itself on Central and Western European literatures. And because modernism began to explore different approaches to literature, Ukrainians were able to take advantage of these. This idea of newness, freshness, the excitement of discovering the local, the novel in the local, the authentic. These were things that Ukrainians were thrilled by. So there was a sort of a neo-romantic or neo-folkloric element in modernism, which Ukrainians took advantage of. But modernism was also associated with feminism. A lot of the modernist writers from the late 19th century were women. And, you know, everything I've said, you know, if it makes your skin crawl to be told that your secondary, tertiary, someone else should speak for you, I think you'll recognize feminist concerns there. So there's a good reason why Ukrainian women, writers, intellectuals, were attracted to the literature, to an anti-imperialist Ukrainian literature. So Ukrainians discovered that they had a voice, they had something to say. Life was not elsewhere. You could look into the Ukrainian way of life and write about a modern, interesting, new world. And this has continued. In the 1920s, there was this a great explosion of creativity in all aspects of life, in literature, in art, in music, and in everything. And it has gone down in history as the cultural renaissance of the 1920s. The idea for many of these groups was that Ukrainian culture was a hidden Atlantis. It is something just beneath the surface that needs rediscovering. And they set about doing this. They were people of the Renaissance. They would sort of rediscover this glorious past, which had been covered over in time. So the idea was to break through this straitjacket and write about our own people. I'll just finish with a few comments about today. I think Ukrainians, since independence particularly, have tried to go beyond the dependency of opposition. And this has been an attempt to explore what makes us special, what makes us different, what makes us ourselves. A multicultural, a complex, a sophisticated culture is being developed, and Ukrainians try very hard to do this, but they also have advantages now. They don't have to be, their culture does not have to be mediated through Moscow, mediated through Russia. It can go directly to Europe, to other countries. Direct contact with the West is possible. So you have numerous translations to and from Ukrainian, from Western languages. Ukrainians can speak directly to writers and intellectuals in the West. However, the stereotypes persist. And if you look carefully into what Russian writers or Russian intellectuals often say, it's almost like they're still using these old tropes. The mentality is still there. And you see this even with common people. I once spoke to an emigre from Russia. I think I overheard a conversation, if I'm not mistaken. So where are you traveling to? Canada? No, I'm not going to another small country. The United States, only big, strong, powerful countries. I was absolutely stunned. Where does he get this idea? Well, it's very much this idea that we only deal with the powerful, the big. And moreover, this resistance to imperial designs is still a big feature of Ukrainian life. It's like a reflex reaction. Sometimes it's not very pleasant. People constantly want to have their name pronounced correctly or be recognized as Ukrainians, even in small, insignificant ways. But it's part of this reaction to being put down. I think it's going to be a long journey out of this imperial past, and it's going to involve dealing with this self-deprecating attitude, with anger, the anger of the oppressed or formerly oppressed, and with this sort of pain of the phantom limb. People still feel they've lost something, and they need to keep coming back to it. So it's going to be slow, a steady recovery, but so much of contemporary Ukrainian literature, whether it's Zhadan or Makhno or Sofia Andrukhovich, it deals with so many interesting topics, with so many aspects of the history. It's assimilated Western literature, Western traditions, and it is playing with them. I think it's got a great, bright future. And I'll say one other very provocative thing. I think Ukrainians can speak on behalf of Russians. Russia is having an awful time expressing, itself as a democratic, liberal, tolerant people. Look what it's doing to its youth, to the Nemtsovs of this world. Ukrainians are a potential ally. They're a potential voice in the West. And they can help explain Russia to the West and Russia to Russians. I think I've probably said enough to get some comments. If you like, I can read a few more things, but
yes, please. If you would like to share those quotes with us, that would be great.
Well, it depends on your audience, but I don't know what they're thinking. They're probably shocked and disturbed. Well, if you want, look, this is Belinsky, the great 19th century literary critic. We live in an age of China rising. This is what he had to say about his neighbors in Asia. These Asiatic people, including the Chinese and the Persians, will never, he felt, develop into nations in his sense of the world, of the word. Real people, they ought to be colonized. They have to be civilized. The Russian nation must assert itself, because sooner or later somebody else is going to colonize and assimilate these nations, these peoples. Only Russia has joined the club of nations. And here's what he had to say about Africa. The natives of Africa are lazy, animal-like, slow-witted creatures, condemned to eternal slavery, working under the rod and murderous torture. The poor sons of America, even today, he's talking about the Indian native people, even today remain the same as the Europeans found them, having lost their fear of firearms, the voice of angry gods, even themselves having mastered their use. They have not become any more human from that time. We must seek the further development of human substance in Asia. It was here that creation ended. Nature completed its circle and gave way to a new, purely spiritual development, history. Here, humanity has once again divided into races, and the Caucasian tribe is its flowering. What he was saying was, this Asia, the basic human material for conquest there is better than in Africa, than in North America. When we conquer Asia, the potential there, human potential, is higher. This is our destiny. Well, I think, you know, if you're going to speak about the Russian soul and the Russian destiny and the Russian word, you need to think about some of these statements, because this really is where a lot of this is based. And it makes sense that the new imperial mentality in contemporary Russia is drawing on these views. That's it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Myroslav, for this wonderful talk. And at this point, we'll start our discussion. And please submit your comments either to our Q&A box or to our chat. And while we're waiting for our questions, well, I would like to go back for a moment to one of your final comments about contemporary stage, about Ukrainian literature and Russian literature as well. As you pointed out, a lot of stereotypes from the 19th century still persist, particularly in Russian literature, unfortunately. There is another thing which is closely connected with this. It's imperial legacy. It looks like in Ukraine, Ukrainian scholars, Ukrainian writers are willing to somehow reconsider this imperial legacy, to somehow process this imperial legacy, which I would connect with some sort of trauma processing. As you noted, some of those quotes were very, I would say, not just humiliating, but traumatizing. And they could still be traumatizing today. But still, today, Ukrainian writers and scholars try to somehow deal with these traumas, which were not dealt with, I would say, during the Soviet times, but they were just suppressed. On the other hand, in the Russian context, there is a opposite tendency where imperial legacy is embraced in a very positive way. And I think this is quite symptomatic of contemporary Russia, not only in terms of cultural superiority, which is a constant topic. Even today, great writers are quoted to support some political claims. And there is this conflation of cultural sphere and political sphere, and culture is deeply politicized, again, in Russia in particular. So, how would you, I know that it's probably beyond our current conversation, but how would you explain this kind of embracement of imperial legacy, which is presented exclusively in a positive way, starting from writers and going towards even some tours which are offered in St. Petersburg or in Moscow, where all these palaces are shown as the greatest achievement of culture, while the fact that many people died while constructing those buildings, great buildings, is not even mentioned.
Well, I think the answer is Putin. I mean, there was an opportunity for change. There was a development for a while, and then you got Putin. And on the question of palaces, he just built one in Crimea for, what was it, $1.5 billion. And within a year, some 15,000 people worked on it. Within a year and a half, the whole place they discovered mold throughout the whole place as being rebuilt, refurnished, changed. That is a great metaphor for this sort of imperial glamour. The Sochi Olympics is another, white elephant. I think it's probably, there's various ways of dealing with this and various points of view. I don't have an explanation, but it's probably something to do with the fact that contemporary Russia is finding an identity, a new identity. In the same way as Britain, post-colonial Britain, post-imperial Britain had to come to terms with its past and is still coming to terms with its past. All empires have to deal with loss of empire. It's a painful process, and I think that's what Russians are going through. Many average Russians, not all Russians. And I think that this kind of warming up of certain tropes, it presents people with some comfort. Yeah, Britain had Brexit. I mean, what was that if not an attempt to wave the flag again, to speak about Great Little Britain? It was a rerunning of previous attitudes. We won the war. Look where we are now. A sense of being offended that things did not work out. I think all these things work towards making these tropes accessible. It's really something that political scientists should spend more time studying. But you're absolutely right. They are republishing books. Fascist thinkers like Dugin are praising books like Pyotr Krasnov's books, which were published in the interwar period. He became a leader. He was a leader of the Cossacks, and he wrote some scandalous books about the decay of the West and the return of Russian monarchy. These are all, for me, these are all symptoms of a group of people that are struggling to find a new identity. Mm-hmm. And it's going to take time for that to occur.
Mm-hmm. We've got a comment from Hiraki Kuromiya, and I'll read it out loud. Just a comment. In the 19th century, even Marx divided nations into historical and non-historical, and Russia may not look so different. Yet Europe largely overcame imperialist prejudices in the 20th century after the deaths of millions of people, but Russia didn't and still hasn't. That seems to be a striking feature of Russia.
Yeah, I agree. And that's why I think a discourse is required around these questions. Not a discourse around the greatness of empire, but a discourse around how do we deal with these attitudes, which in the 21st century, they go against democratic norms, against values, Western values, what we call Western values. And it's a very important discussion. It's a discussion for Russians, but it's a discussion for intellectuals concerned with what's going on in Russia as well. Mm-hmm. And yeah, you're right. I mean, the comment is absolutely right. Russia was actually borrowing from Western imperial talk. It was borrowing from Western colonialism. It wanted to be like. And that's why when Dostoevsky said, Europe does not accept us, let's go conquer Asia, when he was talking about Turkey, Constantinople, the East, and why all these intellectuals focused on Asia was because, unlike the British or the French, they didn't have overseas colonies, but here they could conquer another part of the world. So yeah, they modeled themselves on very often on Western colonial empires.
Thank you. We have a question from Inna Tugunsova, and my apologies if I mispronounce the names. You mentioned that new Ukrainian literature is being translated into European languages freely now. Would you say that translations into Russian and Western European languages are evenly balanced? Or is there a tilt towards translating more into languages other than Russian?
Well, thank you, Ina. That's a very interesting question. I can't answer that. All I know is that there has been a tremendous push in recent years to translate works, Ukrainian works, into European languages, the major European languages, but also others. A lot of Ukrainian works are translated into Polish, German, less into English for some reason, but that's beginning to change. I don't know about Russian. That's an interesting question. There should be some research put into that, because that's that's a place of great concern. And I know that there have been attempts by people like Zhadan to, work with Russian writers or Russian musicians, and he has good relations with them. And also many Eastern Ukrainians, in fact, write in Russian. There should be more, but it seems that the literature is either blocked at the border or not given the same opportunity to be distributed. That's a question, I think, that really will define the future, because the attitudes in Russia for Ukrainians are tremendously important, and they have to be Russians have to be wooed a little bit, seduced by Ukraine, rather like the empire tried to seduce them in previous centuries. What was the second part of the last part of the question? The last part of the question was...
The last part of the question, or is there a tilt towards translating more into languages other than Russian? I think you addressed this one. Mm-hmm. Would you say that translations into Russian and Western European languages are evenly balanced?
No, I think that's the problem. When I mean, I'm not an expert on political questions, but when I do talk to people in Ukraine, they very often say, we can talk to everybody, and we can find a language with Poles, with Czechs, with East Europeans, West Europeans, but with Russians, it's a disaster. They're just not listening, or they're just not conversing. And I think that's partially an answer to your question. There's less of it. There's less of this. But there is an attempt to flood the Ukrainian market with Russian books, often with really chauvinistic and strange books, which never get translated because they're essentially political trash. And that's a problem. That's the issue for many Ukrainians and for many Russians.
We have a follow-up question from Hiroki Kuromiya, and I think you partially addressed this question, but I'll read out this question again. Ukraine, like many other countries, is diverse. I wonder how literature in Eastern Ukraine deals with Russia today. I know only a few, Zhadan, Chupa, etc. You mentioned Zhadan.
Yeah, yes, it's a little different. And one particularly interesting aspect of it is that there is a literature that's written in Russian by Ukrainians in Eastern Ukraine. And that's a huge debate now, a huge issue, something that's going to be discussed and talked about for a long time. It is a bit different. This is, as the comment says, it's a huge country, and it has different traditions in different places. There is also a pro-Russian feel to a lot of this writing, and a lot of this, not so much the writing, but the cultural attitudes. So when people travel, when Ukrainian writers travel, they often do have to convince people that there is something worthwhile in Ukrainian writing, Ukrainian culture. That process has been going on ever since independence in 1991, and it is still continuing today.
Well, it's continuing today, and as you said, sometimes Russian maybe scholars and Russian politicians are not willing to participate in a conversation or in a dialogue, because it's only one-way discussion. Either it's Russian strategy or it's no strategy. But this kind of issue also was also transferred partially probably to the West, so to speak, right? Where there is still so much charm around everything Russian, as you mentioned, Russian soul in the first place, while Russian world, which was substituted by probably this concept of Russian soul. But a lot of issues in Russian literature are still not discussed. For example, great Russian writers, they do have some anti-Semitic statements. They have a lot of chauvinistic statements. However, when we read the books, especially here in the West, we do not touch upon those things for many reasons, just to have a more productive, probably, conversation. But the side effect of this silence is that these traumatic experiences to which other nations were exposed to, they still are not dealt with. And I think it's part of this problem about stereotypes which still persist, and about this unwillingness to reconsider, to reevaluate imperial legacy with which Russia comes to the academic environment as well.
Yeah, no, definitely. I'll say two things. First of all, the vast number of Slavic departments in the West are Russist, departments of Russian studies. These people are trained in Russian studies for the most part. So you don't want, I mean, I understand them. They don't want to attract students by showing parts of Russian culture which can be viewed as negative. But I think it's a mistake, because I think it makes it more interesting, more intriguing, more contemporary. And, sorry, and the other part of it was the other part of it, I think, was that when the Orange Revolution happened and the subsequent revolutions happened, the attitude in the West was very often one filtered through the consciousness of journalists, writers in Moscow. Anybody who looks at that, or anybody who lived through it, will understand that for about 6 months after the Revolution of Dignity, there was nothing more positive in the West. It was all this sort of nationalists, fascists. It was strange for anybody who knows anything about the place. But it gradually only changed because journalists began not just going to Kiev for a day, interviewing somebody in the coffee shop on the Maidan Nezalezhnosti, always the same coffee shop, by the way. I mean, those people made quite a lot of money off coffee sold to Western journalists. But they actually started staying there, talking to people and digging in. And the response in the West very often to what those people started writing was also shock. I mean, how can this be? It shows, I think you're absolutely right. It shows that there's a certain tradition, a certain mental framework within which Westerners work. And that is very often a framework that's been developed by a sort of Russophilism.
I think we have enough time for one more question, and I would like to go back to the resistance towards the designs of imperial charm. So it looks like those designs to some extent failed in Ukraine, and during the 19th century there were a lot of works that were actually resisting already, and those works to some extent were informed by the previous centuries as well. And that's probably another conversation which we would like to have a separate episode with you for our talks when Ukrainians actually contributed to the construction of the cultural Russian Empire, to the political Russian Empire as well. But that memory, that cultural memory and political memory was somehow dismissed by the Imperial Russians. So for what reason did these designs of imperial charm, in your opinion, failed in Ukraine? Was it because of some past, or how did this mechanism, in your opinion, work? Why did it fail? Why the Ukrainians didn't just embrace Russian culture, Russian language, and language still remained one of the most important issues even in the 19th century. But still, even when writing in Russian, Ukrainians were resisting the empire.
Well, there's several answers to that. One answer is that it's not quite as simple as empire versus resistant colony. There's this ambiguous area, gray area. And for many Ukrainians, Gogol or Hohel is an example. They could write about their own world, their own Ukrainian world, and not sell their soul, as it were, to Russia. For many Ukrainians, yes, I mean, like as in all empires, yes, we are part of the empire, but we are ourselves. And we will get what we can out of this situation. Another answer, and this is often brought up, I think, in history and in political studies, is that the Russian Empire was weak in the sense that it didn't have the strength to assimilate locally. It didn't have the local administration. And so much of the local administration was actually run by people who paid lip service to empire, but actually were locals. Storozhenko has some wonderful stories along these lines. It's almost like they exist in a parallel universe. When they go to visit the governor general or whoever it is, they put on a certain suit, a certain behavior, and they do what's required. But the rest of their lives are lived with locals, and there's a local culture which is rich and informs every aspect of their lives. I think also empires create resistance. So when you lock people up, we send them to Siberia. You tell them that they're not able to write or to paint or to draw, as happened with Shevchenko. It raises the hackles on people's backs and people get upset. So a resistance builds up. Then there's also the question of Western Ukraine. Only part of Ukraine was in the empire, and Ukrainians made contacts with their countrymen or their patriotically inclined co-nationals, whatever you want to call them, abroad, and developed a whole intellectual, scholarly apparatus, publishing apparatus there, smuggled books in. This became part of the resistance. So, yeah, I suppose if the Russian Empire had been more powerful, more ruthless, maybe that's an answer to your question. Maybe that's why they kept talking about this, because they felt they were losing control. That quite often happens with this imperial-minded individual. It's a question to be studied.
I believe we have one more comment left by Ina Tuguntsova. And even I think this comment is about prejudices that we were talking about previously. And even now, it seems that some prejudices are replaced with new, worse ones. In Russia, that is. I was just there in November. Yeah, that's pertaining to our conversation about stereotypes and prejudices.
Yeah, there's a certain thrashing around, not only in Russia, but in Ukraine, in Poland as well. I mean, Poland, you're not allowed to write about certain things, you know, make Poles look bad when it comes to the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. Similarly, in Russia and in Ukraine, you're not allowed to write about certain things which offend people. Well, it's okay if there's a larger discourse in which different voices can be heard. But when that discourse is very limited, when your people like the Memorial Society is arrested for researching what happened, state violence under Stalin, I think you're in trouble, because there's no opportunity to voice a different perspective. And in that situation, some very nasty attitudes come to the surface.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much, Myroslav, for this fascinating conversation today. And thank you so much for this fascinating topic, which help us see contestedness, I would say, not only of Ukrainian literature, but of Russian literature as well, and complexity of all these issues, which should be discussed, actually. And I'll take our conversation today as this contribution to this openness to discuss complex and contested issues as well. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Today, Myroslav Shkandrij presented on the seductive charm of empire and resistance to its designs, modern Russian and Ukrainian literatures. Thank you so much for attending our lecture. Information about our upcoming events will be posted on the UkrSO listserv and on our Facebook page, Ukrainian Studies Organization at Indiana University. You can also view previous lectures and talks on our YouTube channel, and for future events, please subscribe to our channel. Thank you again for attending our talk today. Thank you.